Please. So thank you all for coming to this event of a type that we've all grown all too accustomed to for a discussion which will involve the following individuals. But before that, just to say the occasion is a launch or a discussion cum launch of a book edited by our own, that is MCC's own Sandeep Mertia, who is joining us today from Jaipur in India, in Rajasthan, a little under the weather, but happily not among the severely afflicted, as so many people are in India today. And he's the editor of this quite remarkable book, Lives of Data, which, at least from my knowledge, is both a milestone as far as computer cultures in India is concerned, but possibly more generally, because there are not so many books on specific countries or regions which are so current, and which involve authors almost all in the first generation of their scholarly lives. And in countries like the US, for example, or parts of Western Europe, where there's a bigger literature, it's very scattered. So again, you don't see a lot of people under one umbrella talking because it's too specialized, too fragmented. So either it goes one way or the other. So I think this is a very remarkable book. Sandeep, just by way of introduction, is a PhD candidate in media culture and communication, which today has a number of its faculty present, including Natasha Schüll, who's going to be one of the respondents, discussants, but also Radha Hegde, and also Tracy Figueroa and Daryl Carter, who are helping us with support. So MCC is very present, and there may be others who are present whom I can't see right now on my screen. So this is, Sandeep is part of that community. Ramon Resendiz, close friend, also a candidate for his PhD in MCC, and perhaps others, as I say, whom I cannot see because I don't have a full list. We are very honored to have as discussants three wonderful and distinguished colleagues. I'll introduce them in the order very briefly, again, because of time, in the order of their place in the program. First, Natasha Schüll, whom I already mentioned, who is our colleague in MCC and has done pioneer work on the connection between self-monitoring, self-making, calculation, risk, devices, gaming, a whole series of connected things on which she's worked before and which she's now moving into new spaces of inquiry. So it's terrific to have her here. She also is one of Sandeep's mentors, readers, etc. So that's another connection, which perhaps some of you know and others do not. Sareeta Amrute, I'm also very delighted to see, having not seen her for a long time. Sareeta is the Director of Research at the Center for Data and Society in New York. But Sareeta and I actually also go back a long way to when she was a student in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago and was doing her work on IT professionals in Germany. And somehow now I've ended up here, she's ended up in New York. So there's some complicated tectonic processes here, but I've known Sareeta for a long time, admired her work, which was quite pioneering for when it was done. When it was not every day that we got studies of IT professionals, ethnographic studies, and so on. And now, of course, she's coordinating, overseeing, and sponsoring all kinds of work in the broad space of computing or data and social issues of all kinds. So we're delighted to have you, Sareeta, with us, and I'm delighted to see you after a long time, though in this slightly to use a new phrase, distantiated way. But finally, last but not least, we have Ramesh Srinivasan, who's another wonderful colleague and a friend of many of us in MCC, as well as in media studies generally, but also in anthropology. And again, as happens when you have a lot of miles on your odometer, I know Ramesh from many lives, including common friends in Palo Alto, where he grew up and where I spent a glorious year before most of you were born. I think Ramesh was probably born then, but very young, 1984, 85. But we've had links of various kinds and then rediscovered those links in the last decade. And I can only say that Ramesh now is doing excellent work at UCLA in the School of Information. And many of you know that he's done work that has brought him to the attention of the broad media, but in a remarkable, consistent position of advocacy for the best and most emancipatory causes involved in the business of data and society, and has been an advisor to Bernie Sanders, but done many, many other things, all of which show a consistent pattern of interest in those who are at the low end of the value chain in the internet economy. And that's a great thing. And it cannot always be said of all our colleagues that that is so. So, and that's true with every subject, that there are people who are more in the front line of equity, access, justice, and those who are somewhat more abstract, technical, remote. So this is a great group. Sandeep himself, I should say, having just said that he's a member of our department, that's a bit understated. Sandeep is remarkable because he comes from a technical background in engineering and in computer technology and related studies, and then became attracted to the social and humanistic sciences in and through an experience, I think, at Sarai in Delhi, and basically moved out of his original technical space. But of course, that technical space gives him a remarkable capacity to know actually what is going on in the black box and not just pronounce, at some massive distance above, which is where many of us end up being, which is studying these things from afar. So Sandeep has a remarkable story of his own. And I think it's a story, I'll just conclude by saying this, which is being replicated in his current fieldwork, where he's observing people who are not dissimilar in background to him, from Rajasthan, from small town India, with technical interests, who are now caught up in hoping that they will be the next great successes in some form of innovation, etc. So it's a story he knows, but he took a different path for which we are, of which we are the beneficiaries. So I stop there and just hand over right away to for her comments to Natasha Schüll. Please, the floor is yours.
And I believe I'll hand it back to Sandeep.
Oh, sorry. See, already the chip failure. It's Sandeep who has 10 minutes, as is customary, to actually say what his book is about, which I could not do in a short space of time. Sorry, Sandeep. You first, then Natasha, then Sareeta, Ramesh. So please.
Thank you, Arjun. Am I audible? Right. Thank you so much, Sareeta, Natasha, Ramesh, for joining this panel. Thank you, Tracy, Daryl, and MCC staff for helping us organize it. NYU Global Asia, NYU South Asia, and even Data and Society for helping us with in circulating the event. So I'll be brief in my remarks today, and also because it's such an excellent panel and I want to hear their comments on the book and then respond, but also because to acknowledge the kind of situation we are in India right now. One is not in the best place to think something new and say something new about this book, but I'll do my job as the editor to briefly introduce it and contextualize it. And maybe then your comments and questions can pull me into a conversation that can make me forget the horror we are living in India right now for a bit. So this book, first of all, I need to thank the Sarai Programme, Center for the Study of Developing Societies, Ravi Sundaram and Ravi Vasudevan in particular, for not just making this book possible, but for making academic life possible for me. And thanks to Institute of Network Cultures Amsterdam for producing it brilliantly and in an open access way, as all their books are. So very briefly, this book comes out of a research project that I started in 2014-15, fresh after graduating. And at that time, when we started looking at data analytics and big data in India in late 2014, early 2015, there was already something, a sort of nascent data studies emerging in major publications and major centers of research on social studies of data, social technical studies of data, and so on. And it was quite a challenge to, at that time, and it continues to be in slightly different ways, on how to look at something that is so pervasive, kind of always already global in its form, and is technically dense, and yet at an everyday level seems more driven by business hype cycles, rather which do not necessarily map onto the practices of various groups within those businesses and allied groups related to them, and other different kinds of actors, whether they are state actors or civic society groups and so on and so forth. So what I did between 2015 and 17, that was the Lives of Data project, which was actually in the beginning called, I named it Meta-Analytics of Data. And thank God Ravi made me change that name. But that was in 2015. And what I was doing was hanging with data scientists in Delhi, in open data community groups, in data analytics meetups, in tech startups, in government offices, Ministry of Statistics, hackathons in Bangalore, and in villages in many rural and tribal parts of India, following various different avatars and lives that data analytics was taking. And so when we organized the first Lives of Data workshop in 2017, even while making the call, it was something that quite clear to us that we need to open up this space to a broader conversation that can bring practitioners in, that can provide language and a certain kind of conceptual umbrella to look at things that are not just missing from the business hype cycle sort of discourse of big data, and now in the last few years, AI, and God knows, maybe 3-4 years after that would be life at Mars or something like that. But to follow the practices of these actors and to bring them into the fold of how social relations of technology are thought in context, and context not being some anthropological cultural whole that some Sanskrit Vedic math formulation of data, which I'm sure I could get a big government grant to do right now. But how to connect ideas in a field that is very rapidly changing. India, in the last 20 years, all that has changed. Just throw some figure or data at you. Last year, we crossed 50% of the population with smartphones. So around 550 to now, after COVID, maybe 600 million people have some form of access to the internet through smartphones. Other 600, 700 million still don't, right? There was no such thing as Aadhaar before 2009. It started as a biometric ID card project for border states. That's it. Slowly, it's the world's biggest biometric database. And that other than its original instrumental use of identification for just government schemes, is used for 1,000 different things in industry, in welfare policies, and so on and so forth. So we have seen a certain kind of explosion of new, not just new kinds of technologies, new kinds of practices, and collisions of old governance models, all kinds of businesses that have been trying to adopt tech. And then, as many of the chapters in the book show, landing up in many new different kinds of gray areas between the new and the old tech, right? So how do you capture that? How do you connect the contemporary, its leading edge, cutting edge, open edge with the long durée? And the long durée here is a very complicated history of colonialism, modernization, caste, inequality, violence of every shape and size, and where state is a very big actor, where you cannot write anything about technology just focused on certain entrepreneurial or innovation practices of a few companies. People can write 700-pager books on that and best-selling books on that, and that they can be called as global histories of surveillance capitalism and so on and so forth. But that seems not a very accurate approach to study most of the world and how technology and society are shaping each other. So that's the broad context in which the Lives of Data project and the book emerged. The workshop, of course, had many different elements as well. Lots of things get filtered out. The second workshop, for instance, was focused on digital money, and fintech in itself has become a whole field of its sorts. But this book is based from the first workshop, and it's a condensation of many of the elements that were there. I'll briefly just read a couple of paragraphs from the book and read the TOC, and then head over to the other panelists. I believe I have 5 minutes left, right? Okay. So on page 10 of the introduction, dominant models of 20th century information economy and governance, from cybernetics to notions of a post-industrial network society, universalized a certain context-free, mathematically representable view of information. Actually, much of the world did not follow the pattern of first encountering digital information and computer networks in a military-industrial complex, followed by expansion into formal markets. With an unprecedented number of people beginning to get proper access to the internet through smartphones in India and the global south at large, both the state and private companies have been grappling with rapidly evolving conditions of governance involving dynamic innovations and changes in media circulation and consumption. With the penetration of everyday infrastructures of computing and the emergence of new technological imaginaries in large parts of the world, context is now subject to a socio-technical production that demands fresh interdisciplinary inquiry. To explore the proliferating machinic and cultural ontologies of data, we need to rethink the relations between technological objects and their social lives. Rather than being unprocessed digital information, data needs to be approached as a constitutive technological object and cultural economic commodity integral to infrastructures of media, governance, business, and life at large. Data, as we know, and as Jeffrey Bowker and Lisa Kittelben and several others have informed us and really shaped our understanding of it, raw data is an oxymoron. So data is never produced in silos. Life of any kind of data is shaped by actual and potential relations with other existing data, classifications, paper and digital infrastructure, statistical techniques, data collection and cleaning practices, and possibilities of circulation. Such a life of data is not entirely new and derives from the emergence of modern states and statistics over the past 2 centuries. While there has obviously been a change in the proliferation of digital media technologies in recent times, with global internet traffic reaching zettabytes, that is 1 trillion gigabyte of data per day, the event of a big data revolution is not about data deluge. Even Abul Fazl's N.A. a 16th century administrative report composed under the Mughal Emperor Akbar, produced unprecedented numerical accounts of the army, agriculture, commerce, caste, and geography. The big data revolution is grounded in changing relationalities between data, technoscientific practices, communication, and connectivity that can be thought of in computational terms and experienced as life in a world increasingly populated by composite human-machine networks. And this is what this book seeks to do, that it seeks to better understand the status of data objects, relationalities, and difference in global computational cultures. And that's just a small nugget of the introduction, and I'll share my screen to go through the TOC. Can you see my screen? Okay, so this is the
Sandeep,
cover.
I don't know whether you can hear me, but time is short.
Okay. I'll just scroll through just name the chapters and different authors. Some of them are in the audience. The foreword by Ravi Sundaram, which sets up the book in history of 20 years of research of Sarai. This section histories, where I have a chapter on Mahalanobis and human computers in 1950s and 60s. Chapter 2, which is software studies history of advertising in Indian cinema. Section 3 forms, where it's Shiva, Ranjit, and Sneha look at data infrastructures and forms from history of science, STS, and digital humanities perspective, unpacking the form of the data object. The next section, political designs, Lili Rani, Anumeya Yadav, and Preeti Mudliar look at different political formations of entrepreneurial citizenship and effects of Aadhaar on access and welfare, and really what happens when you're excluded and how citizens' subjectivity is affected by being excluded by this database. The next section is by practitioners who were very glad to have as part of the workshops in this book, and they bring something that is not usually captured in these conversations. The last section is a collection of 3 ethnographies of various kinds of data practices by Nupur, Akash, and Anirudh. And yes, I invite you all to please read them all. And it's an honor to represent their work here and be in conversation with you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sandeep. We're under a small amount of time pressure. So I can only ask my distinguished panelists, who are all experts at both expanding and contracting, which is a kind of mathematical paradox, but maybe if they take about 8 minutes each rather than 10, but take what you need, and then the audience will have to be a little more concise. So Natasha, please.
Yes, I believe I contracted in anticipation, so my comments are likely around 8 minutes anyway. So as speaking as one who counts anthropology, STS, media studies, and critical data studies in her intellectual and scholarly homes, this book was a deeply gratifying read, and also because Sandeep is my student. Despite my already high estimation of him, I was super impressed reading this. A few years back, in an annual review of anthropology article that I wrote on big data and the so-called datafication of life, this was before I knew Sandeep, my author, Minna Rukenstein, a Finnish anthropologist, and we noted that the scholarship that we were considering focused almost exclusively on advanced industrialized regions in the West, and most often on wealthy, cosmopolitan, and digitally savvy actors within those regions. And we ended the article calling for a number of things, one being more attention to how lower income and culturally marginalized individuals and communities in the West have been affected by data technology. Some great research has come out since addressing that. And to that end, we suggested that too many of the scholars who study such things, and there are so many of those scholars out there these days, such things as power asymmetries and threats to privacy, risk confounding various digital divides when they characterize even the most financially affluent, technologically savvy, and culturally dominant among us as the data poor, with powerful companies and governments occupying the position of the data rich. And although I think that is a very analytically useful divide to consider, it blurs the fact that comes to the fore so well in Sandeep's book volume that some in this world, when we widen our geographic frame, certainly, or even within our own cities, right, are poorer than others with respect to the control they exercise over their data. And it also misses the fact that a total lack of data, which is sometimes celebrated as a push against corporate surveillance, can make subjects as vulnerable in relation to power as when their data is gathered and exploited. The other dearth of data we noticed was not just at home in less wealthy communities, but in the global South in general. There was remarkably little scholarship, despite the fact that all of these technologies were unrolling and unfolding and sometimes being developed and pioneered so robustly in the global South. Where health is less a question of individual lifestyle than a question sometimes of basic access to care, challenges of communicable diseases, and where infrastructural affordances and digital literacy are often lacking. So the research was even starker there, and we urge scholars to widen their frames and start looking at this stuff. Crucially, we urge scholars to grapple with such developments not merely as occasions to produce standalone case studies of the adaptation or translation of data technology and infrastructure into these settings by a different set of actors, right? But as an opportunity to consider how these settings and actors are actively reshaping, repurposing, and not only re-engineering, but sometimes engineering this technology. And that looking carefully at that could offer insight into datafication more broadly. So at the time I was writing that article, I couldn't have imagined that not only articles, but a whole book volume of chapters would emerge on addressing these calls. As Sandeep beautifully articulates in his introduction, the volume is not to be read as an exotic trove of case studies in local applications of monolithic non-local technologies, but as a rich compendium of the ways data technologies are being imagined, designed, experimented with, experienced, and tweaked. The essays together offer stories about the lives of data in situ and beyond, informing how we can think about new global data realities. And I'll just quote Sandeep. Critical here, he writes, is wider research into a variety of sites to unsettle standard utopian and dystopian narratives of a developmentalist parochialism centered on Europe and North America. So bravo on that. The book proceeds from a section on histories to one on forms, then political designs, and finally practices, which I think is a lovely way of dividing the book. I would love to hear from Sandeep whether this was relatively straightforward thematic emplotment or whether he struggled with other possible clusters. As Sandeep knows from working with me, I always love to think through different shufflings and reshufflings of themes. And so I couldn't help doing that as I read through the book. For instance, I thought that it would work just as well as headings of bodies, tools, experiments, or perhaps identities, infrastructures, imaginaries, and all of these plural as in the current setup, since everything is as yet unsettled and in a state of flux. But in the end, I saw that the organization doesn't really matter so much, in that readers can and will follow threads crossing and cross-cutting throughout the volume, with articles in one section speaking to those in another. As myself a reader particularly attuned to themes of subjectivity, for instance, I detected the theme as it showed up in a number of places and ways. For instance, in the various chapters that address design imaginaries, we see the formulation of models of ideal use and models of users themselves, both of which we then see in other places performatively feeding back into the lived experiences and practices of users. For instance, in the new ways of washing and oiling and massaging fingers so that they can be read by Adar's biometric authentication system, or in Uber drivers' handwritten accounting records that sit distrustfully alongside the app's records. And the author, Nupur Raval, writes, drivers expressed a sort of gap a feeling of uncertainty and skepticism, an associated need to check and own the numbers to ensure their weekly payments corroborated with their daily calculations. Or in the driver's gaming of the app's protocol by shutting down or tricking or otherwise getting around the interface. This theme showed up in Anumeha Yadav's chapter on biometrics, where we encounter these scenes of anxiety and disappointment by beneficiaries who are unable to be authenticated by the system and are turned away without wages and benefits. We learn more about the alienation that people feel in Preeti Mudliar's chapter, where individuals are told that they and not the system are broken and in need of repair. And just a side note, going back to my earlier comments, this idea of brokenness was very interesting for me to encounter, because in the Western scholarship on critical data studies, brokenness is embraced as a site of resistance. Here it's showing up in a very different way with very different effects. A quote from that article, and then I'll wrap up. "The machine's every word is breathlessly anticipated by the many people anxiously bent over it and awaiting its verdict." And speaking of waiting, the last chapter that struck me on this sort of theme of subjectivity was Anirudh Raghavan's chapter, where we learn of which is the last chapter in the book, the new temporalities of waiting that data-driven disease surveillance systems promising immediacy bring about in public health actors, public health subjects, expert subjects, right? Along with their own dynamics of distrust. It isn't just the Uber driver, it's also the experts who distrust the bad data that the poor are generating, at the same time that the poor are distrusting the technology gathering the data. So this whole dynamics of trust and distrust that spring up amidst the waiting on the machine, the waiting for the machine's verdict. And that author very nicely characterized this as the obscene supplement to real-time algorithmic decision-making that depends on big data analytics. So that was just a sort of impression of why this book was so gratifying to me, the way that one can, the very rich way that one can read it. And I guess I'll just close by saying that for years I've been wanting to develop a course called Data and Society, a rather large foundational course for the MCC department, but I've held off on doing that because I just wasn't satisfied yet with the state of the literature. And Sandeep, you've now opened the floodgates to that. I feel ready with your book in hand, that will be a much better class. So thank you. And I'll pass it on now to the next panelist.
Thank you, Natasha, for those excellent comments. And I just simply say, yes, this is your turn, Sareeta. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak today. And also congratulations both to you, Sandeep, and all of the authors in the book, many of whom I know a little bit, and I'm very, very proud of the work that you've all done to put it together. I'll also try to keep my comments brief so we can have time for questions. So for me, reading this volume, the foundational question of it is the one that Sandeep asks in the intro, which is, how did data become so powerful, pervasive, and relatable? And although the introduction doesn't give us an answer, reading across the essays in the volume, I think we can see that there are three main movers in animating data, right? These main movers also point to an entire realm of counter data, moves made by extending the logic of data imaginaries and subverting those logics to different ends that challenge the supremacy of these prime movers themselves. So the first prime mover in making data animate, the first data discourse, is that of governance and governmentality. It is not at all surprising that several essays in the collection address Aadhaar. As Sandeep said, it's the largest biometric project in the world. This program might be the most lasting legacy of the Mughal Empire's data imaginaries, as well as the colonial data imaginaries and manias described in many foundational pieces, including Arjun's piece on number in the colonial imagination, which is noted in the work itself. In this post-colonial imagination that we now inhabit, Ranjit Singh, Anumeha Yadav, and Preeti Mudliar all give us visions of data solutionism gone wrong. The state, in its attempt to provide seamless and non-exploitable delivery of welfare benefits and food rations, has wound up producing a broken system that requires constant repair. At the same time, the Aadhaar system sits on top of and therefore is imbricated into existing bureaucratic practices, as Ranjit Singh's essay points out. It is also innovating fresh forms of adjustments by which humans need to make themselves legible to the data infrastructures that will authenticate them. The technical glitches that prevented Aadhaar from working as promised lead to a bifurcated state, as Anu Mehal Yadav tells us from the experience of Jharkhand, where, quote, on the ground, the pressure from local authorities on beneficiaries to enroll contributed, while senior officials reported that Aadhaar was not mandatory to receive benefits or payments. So this bifurcated state where on the ground, there's increasing pressure to enroll people in Aadhaar, whereas at the senior level, there's a line, an ideological line that Aadhaar is in fact unnecessary. The bifurcated state both responds to the failures of governmentality through data and continues to push the state to remake itself in the image of this data imaginary of governmentality. As Akash Solanki outlines, these competing mandates produce a government that is still very much of paper, though the paper moves through many forms of datafied screen-based mediation. The second discursive field that produces the power of data in India is that of development. Okay, there's sort of no surprises here in the sense of what the discursive fields are, but their effects are very surprising. Here again, growing out of the paternal enterprises of the colonial state, documented by Mrinalini Sinha and others, the developmental apparatus likes to see itself as data-driven. As Gunit Narula writes, development organizations produce glossy reports that bring in development dollars, but these reports float on the surface of data that is collected but not shared. In the essays by Anirudh Raghavan on syndromic surveillance and Gaurav Godhwani on state budgeting, data is collected by state or nonprofit entities with a view to improving life conditions, as in the case of disease, or citizen participation in budgeting, as in the case of machinable budgets. Yet these experiences of data collecting need many intermediating steps to make them useful, which both these articles push us towards. One wonders, though, how development as a sector producing data imaginaries also produces, to borrow from Michelle Murphy, a particular surround in which data is understood, interpreted, visualized, and made meaningful. The third data discourse is that of private entrepreneurialism. Nupur Raval's essay on Ola and Uber drivers who keep their own hisab kitab of accounts, and Lily Irani's account of entrepreneurial hackathons for good and the delivery of interstitial advertising in Carl Mendocina, or even the cricket match discussed by Shiva Kumar Arumugam, which teaches spectators to think both in terms of probabilities and in terms of community-based rules, are examples of this third discourse. And what's so interesting about the article on cricket is that in teaching people to think through rules and probability, we have this really interesting instantiation of the whole logic of accountability, in which fairness is not only about prediction and probability, but also bounding that prediction within a set of community-based rules. There's a very nice line in there where Carl tells us that the more this method of statistical analysis is probabilistic, the less fair it is, because every team needs a chance to do well. And really, that's the principle that's underlining all of our discussions about algorithmic accountability today. So it's very interesting for me to see that, that logic being talked about in terms of a large fan-based spectatorship that's also learning these forms, not only in governance mechanisms, but also in the entrepreneurial everyday, that we're learning to think both in terms of rules and in terms of probabilities. So given that these are these three big surrounds, entrepreneurialism, the development discourse, and government and governmentality, one question that really emerged for me is what is the imaginary that's sort of sitting at the center of all of three of these? What is the imaginary of community, of subjecthood or personhood and institution that's emerging at this intersection. And another thing, another way to frame that is, how do our big terms, as Natasha said, the terms that we always hear about when we talk about big data, how are they vernacularized in these settings? To take two as an example, and I'm going to be quick here: privacy and surveillance. Across the essays, there are actually a number of contradictory statements about the importance of privacy in the context of India. So they range, on the one hand, from Preeti Mudaliar's account of the fingerprint, the oily fingerprint, in which she argues that privacy and surveillance are completely far away from the scene in which somebody cannot get their fingerprint detected. And she makes a very strong argument for the subject of dignity being the thing that we should really focus on. On the other hand, in the accounts of Prerna Mukherjee and Mahima Taneja about Outline India, they are very concerned with privacy, because they notice that when they're doing field work asking people to talk about how they wash their hands after defecating, privacy is a key concern to how people answer those questions. Similarly, in our piece on humanities texts, there in Sneha's piece on humanities texts, there's a big concern with the privacy of the data collected. So we have sort of contradictory accounts about whether privacy is important, an important context, in which arenas it is important or not, and how to think about it. I think the third step that hasn't yet been taken, that could be taken in volume 2, as it were, is to think about terms like surveillance and privacy, and to think about when they come to matter, when they come to ground, and what other kinds of terms emerge as equally important, right, within this space. On the same lines, you could say the same thing about surveillance. I'll skip that there. We can talk about that later. But what kinds of gendered, casted, class subjectivities are emerging? And very importantly, what new collective identities, going back to that Ian Hacking idea of dynamic nominalism, what are the names that are being projected into this space? And reading across the essays, I saw many candidates: worker, farmer, fixer, and their vernacular cognates, disposable bodies. Finally, as a last note, then I'll stop. In the next version of this very important volume, I would love to see a conversation among those who are showing us how data lives and makes certain populations available to death or maiming or neglect on the one hand, and those who are using data to produce counter narratives. So what kind of conversation would emerge if we put together the project on open data and making budgets machinable, right? That kind of impulse to produce counter data, to produce different ends, with the analysis on syndromic surveillance, for instance, or the failures of Aadhaar. And again, this is a beautiful account. We see data narrativized in all these ways, and I really appreciate the chance to respond.
Thanks for those wonderful comments, Sareeta. They compress a lot into a small amount of time, as did Natasha's. And now I just want to pass right on to Ramesh, who has listened patiently, has nodded his head a lot, but I know will have some spin, which will add to our feast of ideas. So Ramesh, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Arjun, for convening our meeting. Thank you, Sandeep, for your fantastic contribution with this great book. And just like Natasha was saying, I actually were very consistent with that. This is a book that I really plan on making available and accessible in classes I teach, and more largely within our community at UCLA. I, like you, Sandeep, came up as an engineer, somewhat mystified and sort of in a fog a little bit about some of the technical steps we were taking, and the presumptions we had of those that we sort of were considering to be emancipated, transformed, maybe placed into greater positions or lives of efficiency. These were the discourses that were very much circulating, well over a decade ago, almost 20 years ago, when I was a graduate student, and actually going to India at that time, where there was a great amount of discourse around how the so-called democratization of the digital divide would allow for or facilitate the bypassing of so-called corrupt intermediaries, whether they were state-based, which Arjun has done so much work on that space of political corruption issues, or whether they were sort of, economic middlemen and so on. So there was this idea of data and technology very much in the Indian context as being something that could support frictionlessness, efficiency, and the conflation of some sort of open democracy, right? India being the largest democracy in the world, but also a certain kind of that coupled with the idea of market efficiency and entrepreneurialism, right? So these are discourses that, the first section of the book, the histories section of the book, I think do a wonderful job of tracing. So, in my own way, as an Indian American, reading these parts of the book, it kind of took me back to some of the conversations or some of what I was sort of observing in a somewhat foggy fashion at that very time. I want to point to what you say, Sandeep, in the introduction. So I love all of these different chapters. I like Sareeta, know several of the authors. And, but I also really love the way in the initial introduction that you kind of frame and bring together all of these different conversations. Where you say at the bottom of page 14, perhaps the biggest irony about big data is that it has little to do with data per se. So that is true, as you point out right after that, not only on a technical level, right? Because it's not so much about raw data, it's about the abstractions and patterns that we glean from that data. So therefore the algorithmic and machine learning models, but it's also about classifications and metadata, right? So this takes me back to right after the Snowden revelations came out, when former President Obama said, hey, we're not actually collecting your data, we're collecting data about the data, which in many cases is far more incriminating and sort of targeting as a sort of subject of disciplining, from a Foucauldian kind of perspective. So I think about that quite a bit, not only on the technical level, but also in terms of what data signifies, right? And I think each of these different chapters in this book show different kinds of lenses around the sort of signifying nature of data. So on multiple levels, and my colleagues just pointed this out in great detail, but data as a developmentalist project, right? Really anchoring that. So what are the, and so what, as always, the question in South Asia for me is always like, what is that vision of development? And what does data actually on an intimate and material level have to do with that developmentalist outcome? And as always is the case, who are those kind of structuring and creating discourses around that developmentalist discourse itself? And what do data actually materially mean in that project? So there are several chapters focused on that, right? So that's one lens I think we can look into. A second is, of course, the business entrepreneurial sense, and the sort of discussion of and all the major sort of shifts in territorialization, right? Per Arjun's historical work around mass urbanization as associated with sort of data economies, sort of the discourse of folks like the Bangalore professional business class that the Gandhian vision of India is something of the past. Everyone, you got to move to the city to make things happen, which then have very, very material effects. A reminder that in India, just like in the United States or many other parts of the world, these data regimes have very material effects on territory, on gentrification, on property values, on traffic, on pollution, so on and so forth, right? So I think you do a great job in this book, or the authors do a great job in this book, sort of looking both at the kind of rural developmentalist technological discourse, as well as the urbanist professional developmental discourse as well, which are at tension with one another, as Sareeta was just saying. And so the absence of that sort of conversation between those different sort of ways of valorizing data or mythologizing data, I think is kind of is actually extremely an extremely important point that I think this book exposes. Another, of course, is as related to other, which I remember well, discussions around that when I was going to India back at that time, is that sort of classic dilemma. Again, that people, that citizens are often kind of facing in a fairly blind way between, I would say, discourses around security and efficiency on the one side, so biometric surveillance, kind of authoritarian kind of state stuff, as well as surveillance capture around the idea that if through the provision of this data, your life will be more efficient in a country that is often decried for many reasons as being highly inefficient, right? But then what is, of course, at stake there is not just privacy on the intimate individual level, which is a very Western discourse, but whose privacy, right? Whose privacy, particularly those most vulnerable in a country which is, so unequal on so many different levels, right? In terms of certainly, and which is only amplified by questions of data, right? So that question of how data represents within South Asia, but really in many cases around the world, an amplification of inequality and injustice, I think is key. And I also think this book does a wonderful job of inserting itself, as Sarai has done for many years, as sort of a, hey, this digital divide thing is a non sequitur. In fact, if anything, the sort of so-called open access to digital technologies, or even if so-called literacy and infrastructure kinds of issues are accounted for, we still see an amplification of inequalities and injustices. So several of the chapters point that out, I think, very, very directly. But then I think I just want to kind of end with I think something that I've always, I've been always, so for decades, inspired by Arjun's work. Back as a graduate student, you remember me chasing you down at the new school, and, and which is data as speculative on the one hand. So these are all kind of tense dialectics in a way. Data as speculative capital and speculative power. I want to talk about that for a moment. Versus data as aspirational and as a sort of data as a sort of the substrate upon which sort of emancipatory, progressive social movements are organized, right? The latter of which, I'm super involved with in lots of different ways, as you guys know. So that I think is really, really interesting, right? We are seeing, during this pandemic, how much data is valued, but we're also seeing disconnection between profitability and valuation, right? I make this point, how a company like Uber is worth hundreds of billions of dollars, yet is not profitable, right? And this is the sort of, so this question of how data is connected with the zombification of capital itself, we're so many stages away from a so-called free market economy. But Yanis Varoufakis actually kind of made this point to me when I was interviewing him, that actually now we're in a zombified capital situation where profitability is no longer necessarily connected to valuation. So we see these spectacular moments that are, with flash mobs, with, obviously GameStop is another example of that, and so on. So I think that's very interesting, right? So what does data mean materially in the economic lives in a country that is governed by so many discourses around developmentalism and sort of the idea of being a booming entrepreneurial class that looks up to these tech magnates within South Asia itself, versus data as aspirational? What does it look like? And that's the last question I'll end with. What does it look like to see and practice and engage with data? And you give several examples from hackathons and so on in this book, or specifically, Prerna Mukherjee, Gunit Narula's chapter, even the repair chapter by Preeti Mudliar, are all examples of this kind of counter narrative of data as a sort of facet or substrate for progressive movements and progressive action. So I end just with that question, asking you, because I know that that's where your heart and spirit are configured, Sandeep, just like mine, which is what are our launching off points for a sort of progressive transformation around data justice in South Asia writ large, grappling and wrestling with all of these other discourses that have sort of kind of imprinted themselves upon both global discourses about India as well as within the nation state itself.
Thanks very much, Ramesh, for also a third inspired and inspiring set of reactions, comments, suggestions, questions. Because the clock is slightly against us to the tune of perhaps 10 minutes, which is unfortunately both small and large. Sandeep now. And Sandeep, in this case, having construed your earlier time in one direction, you have now construed it the other direction so that the audience can pitch in for a little while. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Natasha, Sareeta, and Ramesh, for these comments. Obviously, I won't be able to touch on everything briefly, but there's a lot to think there. But starting with Natasha's comments about the data sociality and the public health data piece and annual review of anthropology, it's really interesting how those themes or sub-themes have been taken up in different directions, and proliferations and counter proliferations. I mean, in this, not counter proliferations, sort of dead ends, that certain proliferations that in 2014, 13 were looking like this is going to be the next big thing is something that nobody talks about, right? So I just want to touch upon something that I also wanted to touch upon earlier, but perhaps all touches upon the three comments, is the dimension of contingency in these developments, because these technologies in some pragmatic sense are new. Many of the actors who are associating themselves with technology, who were doing something else before, but are now seeing themselves as part of this new tech economy or digital economy or tech workers, or from gig workers to a unicorn entrepreneur billionaire, many of their own self-crafting techniques are new, and there's a lot of experiment going on there. And many of those experiments fail, and they fail and they disappear from the scene. So part of my focus or part of the lesson that I have learned in almost like over 10 years of trying to follow this mystical, or what Ramesh mentioned, mystification of technology and its links with all of these social forces, is to understand how those experiments proceed and what are the conditions of failure inbuilt in them, right? And COVID is a great example. Many of the apps that were forced down the throat of hundreds of millions of people last year are now completely missing from the scene because, and this relates to the value question, nobody could figure out how to monetize them in the last 1 year. And so as quickly as many opportunist actors jumped into the scene, very quickly they're nowhere to be seen right now. Maybe they'll come back tomorrow with a more horrible thing, but there's something to be said about empirically following them without foreclosing them or without pigeonholing them into a certain kind of social economic actor based on their previous occupations, social background, and then so on and so forth. That's one. To speak to Natasha's comment about possible cross sections and alternate sections of the book, yes, that was a sort of a big challenge, and I still am very new to this kind of work. And I, of course, had the guidance of my mentors at Sarai in this, but there were many possible, and there were several drafts that we couldn't finally include. So it did look different in different stages of the project. Even I think the fourth or fifth version was slightly different than the final one. But yeah, and the idea of subjectivity, bodies, identity, we can use them to crisscross it in different ways. But one of the elephants in the room or the elephant in the room in conceptualizing this was the state. Because conceptually as well as empirically, something that touches the lives of users and non-users in gazillion ways, which we only hear in one news report after another, but are barely able to think through and connect it with technology practitioners and follow their relations in terms of who is doing what for who, right? Many of the state actors and technological actors it's impossible to tell who is in which party now. And there's good research going on in that. So that also speaks to Sareeta's three discourse categorizations of governance and governmentality, development, and third, entrepreneurialism, and how they're kind of, as this book tries to do, and then my research and several others who are doing research in India in this field are trying to investigate how these three are being constantly, the new varieties of khichdis are being made for different kinds of ends, right? For electoral data, one flavor of khichdi; for development, welfare, food, grain, something, another; for Bangalore people, different, more gourmet style; for rural development, something sada with salt and something. But there is variation along, a lot of variation along these existing themes, which needs more research, is all I can say at this stage. And the central imaginary is informed by this state in another way, and then huge influx of capital in and this goes in slightly in my dissertation trajectory, not so much in the book, that in 2020 India had $40 billion of startup venture capital investment, right? And in just 2021 we have had 11 unicorns so far, right? So central imaginary of these guys, unicorns are $1 billion valued companies. None of them have any profit at all, as Ramesh also pointed out. So to follow their central imaginary is a huge task in front of researchers who work in this space, and how the vernacularization, localization, globalization, all of this works. One the very important point about gender, caste, class, just like to flag, there's an lot of important research, and there are my limitations from my social and gender background in terms of how much I can interpret it. But there's an important panel in this year's 4S by Akash Solanki and Palashi Vaghela, who are my college folks and also researchers in the fellow space. Akash is a co-author in this book on caste in and as technology, right? So those are the interventions that are leading the way in helping us not do a conceptual confetti of sorts, that old inequality plus new equality is equal to inequality plus plus, but something that is changing the formulations of both. So I'll stop here. There are many other things as well, but we want time for the audience Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sandeep. We are slightly behind time, not hugely, but I have one question to you and to Tracy and to Daryl and all, and above all to the panelists, as well as to those who have happily stayed on, which is, can we take another, say, 5 minutes or 10? It's a very radical question. Or are there drop-dead deadlines? If so, we have 22 minutes. So this is a kind of shout out about the hard deadline. Is there any technical obstacle to carrying on? Of course, we can carry on, and then those who can stay. But why don't we say, since it's almost 10 after, that we would go to the 40-minute mark here in Berlin, which is not 20 minutes, but 30. And those who can stay, just so that we're not like completely choking everybody, you know, and forcing them to be brief, etc. So if that's okay, Tracy, Daryl, who are helping Sandeep and me, let's consider that 6:40 Berlin, which is about 32 minutes from now, will be our real endpoint, giving us about 10 minutes more than planned. And for our commentators, panelists, if you can stay, wonderful. If you can't, hey, you've already done a great job. So that said, now we go into the most exciting yet strangely volatile space of the Q&A. I welcome questions. Tracy is going to help line them up for me so we can get at least a sampling. I mean,
yes,
we surely will have to leave people to raise their questions later independently with each other, but let's do our best to get at least 2 rounds of questions, of 2 or 3 questions each. So, Tracy, any guidelines on who has the equivalent of their hand up?
yeah. Thank you all. There are two options. You can either post a question into chat and that will go directly to Sandeep. And if there's some that you have received, Sandeep, that you wish to share, you can. Otherwise, please feel free to use the raise hand function and we can also take questions from those who do that. Sandeep, have you received any in chat thus far?
Yes, I do have a couple, but there's one by Mr. Sudhir Jain, and I'll just read the question. Sorry. Okay, and the question is, does this book contain any discussion on how the proliferating and largely compulsory data capture by the government is impacting the privacy and dignity issues of the common man? It's a very important question, which some of the chapters on Aadhaar more directly address, but also something that Sareeta and Ramesh also raised about questions of privacy and privacy sort of this being this individualistic concept of sorts. In terms of how it looks at the subject whose privacy is being discussed. Definitely, and here one of the most important points is that this is not just limited to users, as Natasha also pointed out in her comments, that in a population of 1.4 billion, let me tell you, the active users on Twitter are 17 million. That's it. Active users of WhatsApp on a monthly is somewhere around 400 million, right? That's the peak. Now, what are the others doing? They're still in the Aadhaar database and their fragments of their datafied selves, if I may call it that, are languishing in all kinds of different government databases, leaking somewhere in paper, leaking somewhere in compact discs and elsewhere, somewhere the leak is related to their bank account data or mobile phone data or demographic data and so on and so forth. And the state is wonderfully denies all of that. And there are various champions of Aadhaar who have all kinds of tricks to defend that as an intermediary failure. Now, this is one of the global inventions of where to pass the buck on intermediaries, whether it's Facebook, the election issue, it's all on intermediaries, moderators, and so on, and here as well. But intermediaries are very different from industrialized platforms. We need to look at in which case, whether it is a welfare government scheme sort of privacy issue or a global platform data leak sort of privacy issue, there need to be some sort of socio-technical specificity of who we are talking about. Because credit card number leaks and all are very common.
Okay, so thanks, Sandeep. Tracy, who might be next in our raised hands? Or
yes. Any other questions from the group? I have a question from Salwa. Salwa, would you like to go ahead?
Yes.
Hi.
Our very own Salwa, yes.
Hi, thank you for the talk, everyone. I'm really excited to read this book. It's so relevant and so needed. And I have two questions. I messaged you, Sandeep, so you can read along with me. The first question is about the title. The title is called Lives of Data, Essays on Computational Cultures from India. And in the talk, from what I understood, there was some complexity in understanding context. And so I'm assuming that mentioning from India seems intentional. And if this was written in America and all the essays are from the US, they won't bother writing from USA. So could you talk a bit more on the choice to include from India and connect that to how you're analyzing the relationship between global context and data? And the second question is the book engaging with religion or spirituality or dharma, and how those aspects, which are so prominent in South Asia, are related to the imaginations and construct of data? Or maybe it's not, and if so, why not? And again, congratulations, and I can't wait to read and cite this book.
Thank you, Salwa. We can maybe take at least one other.
Professor Ganti, would you like to?
Yes, Professor Ganti, please.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so excited to get my hands on the book. So I was just so funny you said something about the title. I was just thinking, Sandeep, that the title to me also evokes the social life of things, Arjun's wonderful edited collection. And I was wondering if, in terms of one of the big insights from that collection, was that circulation produces value, not that value doesn't produce circulation, but circulation produces value. My apologies for making it such a soundbite, Arjun, but I was just wondering, in the context of data, is that something, like, because you've all talked about data and metadata, but I was just wondering, is data becomes valuable because it's something that is put into circulation, right? Not because on its own. I was just wondering if that, like to just kind of think of, just kind of extrapolate, expand on that a little bit.
Thank you, Teja. Maybe Sandeep will accommodate one more question so we can take more voices on board. Tracy, is there somebody else?
Absolutely. Does anyone else have a question? You can also feel free to unmute yourself.
Comment or anything else?
Or
because
comment. Yep.
if not, maybe Sandeep can respond to these two comments, questions, thoughts, or anything else. And then we can wait to see if there are others lined up. Sudhir Jain raised hand. So
yes,
Sudhir Jain already had a question, but he has further follow-up perhaps. Haji.
Thank you for the follow-up. In fact, part of my question also related to how this data capture by the government is impacting the privacy vis-a-vis our constitutional guarantees, given that our Supreme Court has increasingly shown a weak backbone. That part.
Thanks. Well put. Thank you, Sudhir Jain. So we will take that also on board. And if there is no other immediate comment, we still have 15 minutes even on our official clock, apart from the bonus time that we have opened up, to ask Sandeep for his thoughts now on these matters that have been raised.
Okay. Thank you for the questions, Salva, Professor Kanti, and Mr. Sudhir. We'll start with Salva's question, including the title in general, lives of data, where lives are two things. One, of course, like in a sense of social life of things, that and lives of scientific objects and biographies of scientific objects, technologies, and one. And second, how our lives are interweaved by these things, where there's any kind of distinction becomes just practically impossible in terms of how we inhabit media and abstractions of it. From, we don't see data on this screen, right? And there's no one sitting at the back end of any one particular platform with all the screens of all kinds of data being visible. There's all different kinds of abstractions and materialities woven together, which fail, coalesce, and do all kinds of, and engineers do all kinds of things with, try to do things with that. But the from India part is something that is a larger predicament, which I don't know I can add anything substantive on that, but all the authors in the book are scholars who work on South Asia, and there were others as well from different countries of South Asia, which unfortunately couldn't make it till the end of the volume for different reasons, including the India-Pakistan institution reasons. I mean, more than the global and from India or the US distinction, one of the things that is, and I'm also thinking about Sareeta's recent special issue on computing in / from the South. So it's something that we all kind of struggle with, and global South, it is, as many of us know, is a non-place, right? It's not, there's no address, pin code can be assigned to it. But and frankly, many parts of South Delhi are way better than Brooklyn. So where is the global south north distinction. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but to something that Professor Tong Lam pointed out last time in the book event at University of Toronto is in terms of rather than comparative thinking, using one to think about the other and so on and so forth. And in the case of, for example, China, when we look at India and China and think about them together, many of these distinctions of South and North don't really work. What you encounter is an unprecedented challenge of scale, and of speed of change, where the teleology of modernization is not set till from post-war Euro-America to IT revolution, but is different. And what different state actors do to change that trajectory enters into the picture. So that is one way of handling this. Those are my very limited thoughts on that. But of course, you're completely right. I wouldn't have been able to get away without including from India in the title, of course. The religion part, unfortunately, there isn't, or maybe fortunately, otherwise I would have been in trouble. But given the political climate in India, but it is an important topic, and religion and media in general in South Asia is a very lively topic, which has evolved in so many different ways in the last 10, 20 years. And yeah, I don't have much to say on that, but it's a really important question. To get to Professor Tejaswini Ganti's question about circulation and value, this is a question that I think was first very substantively raised in a special issue by Kaushik Sundar Rajan on knowledge value, before all the big tech phenomena sort of emerged in the early 2000s or so, if I'm correct. It's in a special issue of East Asian STS, Science and Technology Studies, that when these databases of value were being emerging, that this idea of knowledge economy of Manuel Castellan sort of kind of technological globalization. After that, what happens to the knowledge/value distinction, who is a knowledge worker and so on. And that in just last 10 years, that distinction in itself has transformed so much beyond recognition, something that Ramesh also touched upon, that where is this idea of zombified capital, right? Where is profit and where is value production? In the Indian context, I would add that a lot of value to these things is not entirely limited to the from India part. Many of the financiers of this world are not based in India per se. Many of, I mean, where is Sequoia based? For example, it's not just an India thing. It takes money from the petro sheikhs and puts it in the Silicon Valley and puts it in Bangalore and does something in Japan. So it's that way. In terms of territory, it is very complicated, but there is an aesthetic dimension to it, which is sort of not really explicit in these set of chapters, but is very much there in terms of what value looks like technologically, right? What kind of pitch do you need to make to sound innovation-like, or to sound something that will produce value in the next 5 years, 10 years, and so on and so forth. So I just add that circulation is something that more empirical studies of it will probably enlighten us better about how value is being produced, not produced, how value that was judged 5 years ago on a certain company being like WeWork was supposed to set up offices in Jaipur 2 years ago. The WeWork India guy is nowhere to be seen in the media now. So out of circulation, out of value, both. But why did it went out of circulation is another story. Last part about privacy.
I think we are really rushing on time. So I know coverage is always a challenge for both big media companies and for scholars. But let me try to move along to say, these are great comments, and I have a curatorial suggestion, which is that I make a few comments because I have few thoughts of my own. I'll try to make them as brief as possible, and then ask our commentators, our committed commentators, Natasha, Sareeta, and Ramesh, to say some things because their comments have come up. But if I don't squeeze myself right now, I would be, as it were, forever silent, as we say in some marriage rituals in the US, speak now. So as the co-convener, let me just say a few things about this terrific discussion, which alas will be of value only to the dwindling number that remains. But that dwindling number includes about 5 or 10 of you who are very serious people. So I don't care because it will echo out to unknown millions. So I'm sure of that. No worries there. So here are some thoughts about the many difficult things, including the business of India. This book is about India. So how do we bring it into class? How do we bring it into teaching? What does it tell us? Even if India is 1.4 or 1.5 or 1.3 billion, which ought to make it, somewhat more interesting than a study, say, from Estonia, a country which I have great interest in, but there's some numerical limits there. And I've spent my entire life pointing out that India is what it is at any time, starting in my childhood to now, and China is what it is and was. Together, they're like 2/3 of the planet. So what's their impact on what we think and what we understand? Like 1% of our general understanding. End of story. Do we need to say more? Well, we constantly need to say more. And it's not about Saeed and Orientalism. It's just like, check the numbers. Are you interested in the planet? Or are you interested in your 2 friends, or 3 whatevers, on Facebook? Check the numbers, and it takes nothing except simple arithmetic to say if 3/5 of the planet, that is India plus China, is displaying some patterns, the rest are footnotes. Don't ask them to be fitting in to some idea you generated out of the remaining whatever percent. So this is an old thing for me. I won't go on about it, but I remind us that in this regard, nothing has changed. It's not suddenly that India and China have begun to explode population-wise. That's an old story. So there's that. But I want to say a few things because you're all tremendous colleagues who study these things closely. And I take off from the comment that I think Ramesh made, but it's consistent with many things all of you said, which is the disconnect between profitability and valuation. That's no small thing. It means capitalism itself has changed. And it means it furthermore has changed in a way we don't understand, including our Greek friend. It's not like he has the answer, but he is brilliant because he's got the question. The question is, what does it mean when profitability and valuation have become totally disconnected? That means, in my mind, that questions of number, countability, and scale have come completely separate from questions of what we would call qualia. How do I think of this or that? Also so-called qualitative in older terms. What's the qualitative got to do with the quantitative? If the disconnect, the 2 tracks are going in totally different directions, maybe it's time to rethink our theory of capitalism, both what it is and how to resist it. So it's 100% important point, and it's part of my own interest in derivatives and so on and so forth, where there's zero to do with supply and demand. This is an economy with no scarcity. I can write a derivative contract from here to tomorrow. I can write 10 million. So Samuelson can be thrown out the bloody window. So what does that mean? I don't know. But I would say Yanis is not totally clear on it because he's also trained that way. Very hard, whether Yanis or David Harvey or Frederick Jameson or whoever the person may be, to understand what it means. When there's nothing to do with scarcity, nothing to do with supply and demand, no curves meet. Where's the Samuelson for this economy? Answer is nowhere. So we have to find that. Anyway, I'll shift to a second point and quickly make my third point. The second point is, for me, the key word in Sandeep's book, and which I'm forced to think about again, is data. I mean, of course, there's another set of words which I'm also very interested in, like off, from, in. And my major guide in this, the great American literary critic William Gass, who wrote about all sorts of prepositions like if, and then. I urge you to look up William Gass, spelled with 2 S's. A man more in my generation, but with some things to say about those small prepositions. Deep thoughts. So I agree completely. In, off, from, very tricky terrain. But let me go right to the other word, data. And in some little work that I've been doing recently for UNESCO and all that, I've been trying to think, what is this data? It appeared somewhat late in my intellectual life. So what is this thing? And I thought I knew something about knowledge and information and curiosity and research and all. But suddenly we have a whole galaxy, indeed a universe, defined by some other word. So what is it? So it's a word I knew, but I thought it had a small role. Now the little dog has become the big dog. So what is it? 3 things that I think about: pattern seeking, storage, and search. If something doesn't meet the criteria of pattern seeking, which I think Ramesh and others have mentioned, storage, that is storability, and search, it doesn't count. It's data. That is data. The rest is some other vague fog, knowledge, wisdom, forget all that. Data is pattern seeking, storage, and search. So I immediately ask, what does this mean for a place like India or any other place, including the US, especially the US? If data means this, and we are defined by being data producers or data consumers, that means pattern seeking, storage, and search is all we're about. That's our humanity in toto. Is there something wrong there? Yes, and we don't need India, New Guinea, whatever, to make that case. It's right at home that it's a shrinking of the definition of significant knowledge, which serves all kinds of interests, but there's nothing legit about it because there are 3 criteria there. They are recent, they are corporate, they are profit making, etc. And when profit has become completely disconnected from valuation, then it's even crazier. Because it's not even like industrial capitalism because somebody's getting rich. No, somebody's getting rich because they're getting poor. A little puzzling to me. So the last point I'll make is when you look at Sandeep's book, which I think is a brilliant and a milestone of production, with credit to all its authors, it also makes me think about something very new to my own thinking, which is that this word data, lives of data, of which this is an ethnography in a country of 1.4 billion, therefore not a citing from a sample of 5 people or my friends whom I met in the class or people I met in the corridor of my psychology class where the N was 22 and then I projected to humanity. So it's a slightly better sample for sure. Still, what is it most stimulating to me? And answer is this: it has to do with something I'm very interested in now, which is that the word data also has something to do with another word, which is a little older, and that word is archive. It's a word we all know, ARCH, that word. So I'm very interested now in what I think of as traces of the future. That is, when you are in an archive, you have 10,000 bits of data. Sure, you can look for patterns. You can look for patterns 250,000 ways or 250 million ways. That's what the NSA is doing. That's what this one is doing. That's what Google is doing, frankly. My point is, which are the traces that is in the archive, which are actually traces of the future, not of the present or the past. People do this, people like that, etc. So that's my interest. And I'm saying that in this book, what's most exciting to me is that inside the data question is another question. Are there traces here of things to come? And the things to come, as all of you have said, can either be very dark, new forms of surveillance, control, abuse, exploitation, or new possibilities of redemption, emancipation, freedom, etc. But they will not be because those traces are predictions. They will be actual traces. They won't be forecasts. So forget the business of forecast, predictions, looking in the glass crystal, there's that, nothing. What if we just say the future leaves its own traces? And in those traces, our problem is A, to identify them in the universe of big data, and B, to decide which ones give us some hope. Rather than, so anyway, all this is a long comment to say this is why I am excited, in addition to many other reasons that Sandeep has adduced. And I have indulged a little bit my own reactions, but that's because it's a serious intellectual conversation, which I value. And now I do need to ask Sandeep if you want to say something now, not in order to cover my points, please, that zero obligation there, but just about the event or this or that, before we say thank you, goodbye to our contributors, to our hardy audience, whoever has remained, etc. Sandeep.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Arjun, and everyone else who asked questions. I'll quickly summarize. And I mean, the point of this book is, as it says many places in the chapters as well, it's a starter of a conversation and a certain kind of conceptual reorientation that it seeks to have that conversation productively, and not like repetitions of all kinds of critique of these systems, which are there in last several decades of critique of modernization, development, neoliberal governance, and so on and so forth, are with us. And how do we connect them with larger questions that are not just about, say, Aadhaar as a particular project, but what Aadhaar does in the broader schema of citizenship. As I think Sareeta also mentioned, that this will outlast many of its current champions. So that's the broad general spirit in which this book was formulated, that it's a conversation that we will be forced to have. So how can we have it in more generative ways without downloading concepts based on how much of citation patterns they have, and thinking afresh from the ground, and the ground in itself being a moving terrain, not some fixed village where we can go and understand these things in particular. And the last point about the progressive and counter visions of these technologies, which have also emerged and in many ways have their own stories to tell. I mean, go back to Chris Kelty's fantastic ethnography of open source software engineers, and how these people document their practices. So there is so much to be done in terms of just, I mean, ethnography today, and this has been a conversation about COVID and digital ethnography in so many ways. These people write about their practices at great length, and they're available on their blogs, websites, podcasts, this and that. And we need to be attentive to what they are doing in order to theorize the larger moves in capitalism with capital C and archives with capital A and history with capital H and so on and so forth. Yeah, that's where I'll conclude. And thank you so much once again, everybody. Please forgive me if I was not able to touch upon any of your questions and comments. They'll stay with me. I'll go through them, and I hope this sparks more conversations. And volume 2 may not come from me. I have to do my dissertation, but Sarai continues to work on these themes, and there are various other researchers who work on these themes in very creative ways, and I'm happy to be part of them. Thank you.
So let me now say the formal thanks to a series of people, to Sandeep, first of all, for having midwifed and curated this book, to all his authors, collaborators, for giving us this feast of studies, to our 3 distinguished respondents who all put before us really terrific queries, thoughts, ideas, to the whole audience that came at different points and stayed to different amounts of time, but based on their constraints, to MCC, to Tracy, to Daryl, to whoever else was involved, and to all of Sandeep's peers and friends who are here to express appreciation as well as solidarity with this exercise. And I have to also say, especially in the circumstance where Sandeep is in the midst of an incomprehensibly dark moment in the history of India and of COVID by any standards. This is a horrendously dark moment. And so I'm hoping that all our friends and family and connections in India, but starting with Sandeep himself, his parents who are in Jodhpur, his family, his relatives, somehow find a way through this really disastrous moment. And we would be, I think, remiss if we didn't have this conversation on the grounds of that fact, because we have to keep, holding on to the possibilities. And that question of possibility and probability came up many times today. I'm fully committed to it. Sandeep has made a big investment in that space by his book, but also by what he's doing now, how he's doing it. So thank you all. And on that note, please feel free to sign off. And I will myself. Bye.